Called smuggler ants. They just bring in a few kilos here, a few kilos there. In some places, only a few ounces. Difficult bit of the trade to get into because it's constantly changing.
Having cleared customs and immigration, the suspect was arrested. The huge international trade in drugs has become the biggest problem for those fighting organised crime.
The police response will never cope with the trade in drugs. The best we can do is slow the rate of increase. A good day for the police is a day the problem doesn't get any worse.
Another one down the back.
2 kilos of heroin was strapped to the body of Vilom Prashar. He was later sentenced to 8 years in prison.
I've got the surveillance team jacked up for tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. They'll be coming up to the yard to be briefed.
The drugs trade brings many problems. Scotland Yard has a special unit devoted to drugs-related violence.
There is no doubt that the greater the profits, the greater will be the motivation to defend your profits and indeed to go on and to increase them. So if the stakes are very high, and they are very high, then the propensity to violence will increase at a commensurate rate, and that sadly is the current picture.
A dealer selling crack cocaine to a female undercover police officer. The drugs are collected for evidence by a detective who's been hiding in an adjoining room. This was Operation Motion, run by Scotland Yard to counter the growth of violence related to drugs dealing.
The unit was set up in the early 90s to deal with the explosion in crack cocaine. It's expanding, becoming much more violent. There is massive amounts of money to be made in that particular commodity. So a lot of our work is actually aimed at crack dealers.
The police turned a flat in a respectable building into what appeared to be a brothel.
We manned that with a couple of undercover women who were police officers, with a minder who was a police officer, and we basically just phoned up these yardie crack dealers and invited them to come down, and if they had drugs and were selling drugs, to sell them to us in this brothel. This chap's called Sooty, that's his street name. This is his first occasion down, and the girls are making him welcome. You'll find that he conceals his drugs down his underpants. In fact, maybe further up his underpants than that. We never quite found out. She's had a problem with this guy. He's been late. She's chastising him in a friendly way to remind him that the next time he comes, he better be on time. Because if this had been a real-life brothel scenario, instead of a police sting, then quite obviously the brothel person wouldn't have been very happy with having to wait hours for any drugs they wanted. Obviously undercover techniques are established now and they're being used widely. And I personally use that technique with girls and positively aim at using their sexuality where I can. But obviously within strictly controlled guidelines and within advice we get from our legal people. This chap, Mr. Young, was also late, and he was very anxious. On his way down to this plot, there were a lot of uniformed police officers around. Had absolutely nothing to do with us whatsoever. It's generally been a very stressful day for him. Unfortunately, it gets a lot more stressful. And as he leaves, unfortunately for him, he's about to get hit by an arrest team.
Get back on the thing now.
I was very, very concerned right from the very beginning for the girl's safety, and that was why we put a police officer in to look like a pimp in case something had gone wrong, in case the drug dealers got violent. In fact, in case the drug dealers became over-friendly, shall we say, because they thought they were talking to professional prostitutes. At the end of the day, we arrested 36 of these dealers, and they were all convicted, with the courts able to see exactly what we were doing in the brothel, everything recorded on video.
My job is to push the boundaries as far as I can without putting the officers here at risk, and that if we step over the bounds of what is lawful, then that is my responsibility, and the responsibility stops here.
The methods employed by Commander Grieve's Criminal Intelligence Branch to achieve their considerable success include informants, undercover officers, surveillance, and technical devices they won't even discuss. They could be a worry if they were not strictly controlled.
Yes, this is morally difficult territory. This is at the edge of what is possible, but we look at the law and we try to do all that we can lawfully to bring these criminals to justice. And the Court of Appeal have provided us with some very precise and powerful guidelines which we follow in our use of informers, in our use of technology, in our uses of gathering evidence, and in the relationship between intelligence and evidence.
The drugs dealers on the streets of London are only bit-part players in international and organised crime, which has become a worldwide business.
In many ways, criminals have taken advantage of free movement at a pace which is ahead of the reaction, certainly of conventional law enforcement, certainly of the legal processes. So London is inextricably an international city, an international crossroads, and we are vulnerable in the same way as any other major international centre to the increasing activities of international organised crime.
In the drugs trade alone, London is a focus for criminal organisations from all over the world. They import ecstasy-type drugs from the Netherlands, amphetamines from the Netherlands, France and Belgium, heroin from the Golden Crescent via Turkey and the Balkan route, cannabis resin from Pakistan and Morocco, herbal cannabis from Jamaica and Western and Southern Africa, and cocaine from Venezuela and Colombia. But perhaps London's biggest involvement in organised crime is in money laundering. Criminals from all over the world invest in the city to give themselves legitimate income from their illegal money. The figure has been put as high as £4 billion.
If a substantial part of your legitimate economy, the economy above the ground, is in fact being undermined by money which is criminal in origin, dishonest money, then that has a potentially corrupting effect on your entire economic structure.
Money laundering attracts most international criminal organisations to London. The Italian Mafia has a presence in the capital, although little is heard of its activities. The best-known case in recent years was when disgraced banker Roberto Calvi was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge in 1982. He was believed to have been murdered by the Mafia's heroin traffic manager in London, Francesco Di Carlo, although he was never charged. However, Di Carlo was sentenced by a British court to 25 years in prison for drug offences.
Di Carlo owned Leo's wine bar in Streatham, South London, but his real money came from organising the Mafia's secret drugs line, spreading halfway around the world. It wasn't, though, until a shipment of furniture arrived at Felixstowe from India in December 1984 that intelligence became evidence. Agents in Britain and Canada seized £93 million worth of heroin and cannabis. The Mafia ring has now been broken up in Britain, but the organisation's believed to be already regrouping.
The Italian Mafia is here and has been here for several years. We were always the place of rest and recuperation, to use the Italian cliché. This was a place where you could take to the mattresses. The knock-on effect we're seeing now is of Italian Mafia figures who are not only here for rest and recuperation or to evade attention elsewhere, but are developing their activities. Drugs and money laundering would be an example of that.
However, it's criminals from Eastern Europe, the so-called Russian Mafia, that may become the biggest threat to Great Britain from organised crime. The murder in London in March 1993 of two Chechen brothers was one of the first signs of the lawlessness which is running out of control in the old Soviet Union, spreading to this country.
Police were first alerted to the double killing when they were called to this house in Harrow, North London. Workmen had become suspicious of a crate delivered to the garage of the house. The box was said to contain antiques, but inside it detectives discovered the decomposing body of a Russian businessman. The subsequent search of a luxury West End penthouse revealed another murdered Russian, the brother of the first victim. Both are believed to be from the newly formed state of Chechen. Both had been shot 3 times in the head at close range.
Ruslan and Nazarbek Utsayev were believed to control the London market in Eastern European art objects stolen from museums. A professional hitman, Gagik Organised, was convicted of their murder. 14 months later, Karen Reid was shot in Woking in what was thought to be a revenge killing intended for Organised's wife.
I looked up and I could see a bloke standing at her door, and he had a gun in his hand, and he could bang about 4 shots.
This was an absolute callous assassination. You can't describe it in any other way.
One of Scotland Yard's biggest concerns is the scale of activity in many areas of criminality in Eastern Europe that are spreading westward.
Vice, drugs, extortion, kidnap, money laundering, counterfeiting, violence.
How much is here so far?
Some. Sufficient to get our attention.
The number of operations that we are now running jointly with colleagues around Central and Eastern Europe and in the areas of policing where we are working together has exceeded our predictions.
I've met some foul, dangerous, evil, wicked, treacherous, violent people from I think just about every country on the globe. I wouldn't necessarily want to identify one country's been worse than the other. There just happen to be an awful lot of them in Eastern Europe at the moment.
The notorious Triads from Hong Kong are another criminal organisation with a presence in London. They too are involved in many areas of criminal activity.
Come out, please. Come out, please.
This is a raid on a brothel in London run by the Triads.
Just keep quiet and we'll tell you everything that's going to happen in a minute.
The major impact of Triad activity within certainly London, it's true elsewhere of the United Kingdom, has been upon Chinese communities. They are the victim communities who suffer from the activities of Triads.
London's Chinese community is the oldest and largest in Europe. Many live in fear of the violence of the Triads.
They will violently chop people in a public place, not down a quiet black alley. They'll do it in a public place in front of people. It's a message to the community. And that's where a lot of the fear actually stems.
It's difficult for the police to investigate any crime involving a member of a Triad.
Because fear of retaliation. Retaliation with the Triad. You can arrest 3, 4, 5, but what about the other people? Yeah? How are you going to stop them coming? They'll want their revenge.
To watch the Triads, Scotland Yard has established a Chinese intelligence unit.
It's very difficult to quote exact figures, but here in Chinatown, perhaps 70% of the restaurants will be paying some sort of protection money, maybe. There is this permanent level of fear. If you are Chinese, you perhaps have reason to feel frightened of Triad involvement.
Although at present Triad activity in London is mostly confined to the Chinese community, the worry is what may happen when the sovereignty of Hong Kong reverts to the Republic of China in 1997 and there's an exodus from the colony.
There are signs that they are making arrangements to come here, but they are keeping their options open at the moment. They are creating themselves safe havens around the world just in case things don't go their way in 1997. And yes, some of them have, I think, made arrangements to come here.
But in fighting organised crime, the 400 or so London-based major criminals are Scotland Yard's biggest concern. This is the Arif gang holding up a Securicorps van in South London. They were ambushed by the flying squad and arrested. Mehmet Arif and his brother Dennis, the gang's leaders, were sentenced to 18 and 22 years in prison. 8 months later, a third Arif brother, Becker, was recorded by a police surveillance camera watching the arrival of another Securicor van, which he was planning to rob.
It has been said that there are no true Mr. Biggs in British indigenous crime. My own fear is that there are people who have actually allowed to become bigger than they ought to have been. But they are not international organised criminals.
It's more like a webwork of old alliances and hatreds and associations. It's more about who you grew up with, who you've been in prison with, who you committed crimes with in the past, who grassed on who. You all got grassed against by one person, you're inclined to come together into a cohesive group. So it's more about that.
4 weeks later, Becker Arif and his gang return to rob the Securicor van. Arif is in the silver car. As the Securicor van arrived, the flying squad moved.
Get exactly where you are! Get out! Get out of the car! Get out of the car! Leave it! Over here.
Becker Arif was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison for conspiracy to steal and firearms offences.
Face down!
Another investigation which made use of many of the techniques at the Yard's disposal concerned a major South London villain, Joey Pyle. Pyle had been an associate of the Crays and the Richardsons. He was known to be involved in drugs dealing and other crimes, but had escaped any convictions for over 30 years. There's a little-known Scotland Yard squad, part of the Criminal Intelligence Branch, whose job is to target major criminals, the Special Intelligence Section. They were given the job of trapping Joey Pyle. For months, surveillance teams watched Pyle's every move.
We will find out where he's living, who he's living with. Has he any girlfriends? Has he got any soft spots? We would identify his main associates, who he mixes with, who he drinks with, where he goes to, and just generally do all the background information on it.
They followed Pyle to Pinewood Studios in Buckinghamshire, where he had a film company, Touchdown Productions. The SIS then had a stroke of luck. A man arrested for fraud by the City of London police, Richard Green, said he wanted to give information on Pyle. He was heavily in debt to Pyle and terrified of him.
Richard, at the time, was being used by Pyle as his right-hand man. He was fronting for various operations that he might have running at that particular time. And the information he gave us specifically related to a heroin deal, which Pyle started running when one night at, I believe at his home address, he invited Richard along and asked Richard if he knew somebody who was interested in purchasing large amounts of heroin.
The SIS now placed hidden microphones in Pyle's office at Pinewood Studios. They also installed an undercover officer acting as a secretary called Lucy in an office close to Pyle's.
I was there to watch for the movements of the people that Joey associated with, and whenever he was in the office, then I'd inform Terry and his boys that he was there, or whoever may have been with him.
She was in a lot of danger, I'd have said. Although we were within 5 or 10 minutes away from her as a backup, but I wouldn't like to think if Joe had found out that she was an undercover officer, what would have happened?
I actually took a liking to him. He's a nice chap, and as Lucy, he was very nice to me. He did chat to me and call me Lou, little Lou.
So the next step from there was to confirm to Pyle that we wanted the deal to be brought on, and we were going to introduce an undercover police officer to be our buyer. So we were relying on the credibility of Richard being the introductory agent of the undercover buyer, so that Pyle would trust the person that was going to come into his criminal network.
As surveillance on Pyle continued, Richard Green, having introduced him to an undercover police officer, was sent to prison for fraud.
Really, that forced the issue, because Pyle, if he wanted to carry on with the heroin deal, had to deal direct with the undercover police officer.
By now, Pyle's every move was being watched and every conversation with the undercover officer, Steve, was recorded. They agreed to meet at the Sheraton Skyline Hotel at Heathrow, where Steve would pay £14,000 for 7,200 capsules of a drug called Omnipon. The plan was that an associate of Steve's, who was another undercover police officer, would park a red Vauxhall Astra in the car park of the Sheraton in view of Pyle and Steve and a police surveillance camera. An associate of Pyle's, Peter Gillette, then arrived and transferred the Omnipon capsules into the Astra.
Is that him now?
Yeah.
Yeah, Sierra. Oh, good boy. Now, is he going to get round the back? Is he on his jacksie?
No.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd do the same if it was mine. Yeah, that's my boy. It's a good lad, that's it. Is that it?
Not bad, yeah.
No, there's no problems at all, because there's 2 bags in there, right?
Yeah.
So what's your man going to do now?
He's going down the motorbike with me.
Steve then gave Joe £14,000, which was the money agreed price for the Omnipon, and Joe walked out, and Joe was then arrested.
I think he was totally shell-shocked. I think he couldn't believe it had actually happened to him after all those years, that he, Joey Pyle, was being arrested. And I think that he thought that he would still get away with it, even then.
After 3 trials, which included attempts at jury nobbling and witness interference, Pyle was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. But there was one unresolved aspect of the investigation. During their inquiries, police had discovered a stash of 40 kilos of heroin in a warehouse in Wimbledon.
Now, we were, together with Terry's people, keeping observation on that stash, which was at the time the largest ever police seizure of heroin in the United Kingdom. And we were fairly confident that in some way that heroin was part of the deal that Pyle was trying to put together.
The heroin was never collected, and there was insufficient evidence to charge Pyle with any offence in connection with it. Commander Grieve seldom emerges from the shadows. His concern is that anything he says may give an advantage to the highly sophisticated organised criminals from all over the world that he and his colleagues spend their lives fighting.
The constant seesaw is the counterintelligence from their side. They're constantly trying to find out how we did it. So if I've been selectively enigmatic or lawfully audacious or any of the other phrases, it's because I don't wish to tell them too much, because they will play this tape over and over again. We know they've played other programmes. They watch all the time. What is it they can learn? Well, I hope they haven't learnt anything that they don't already know.
Well, there's one fact that I'm absolutely certain of, is that we, the police, cannot do this on our own. The harsh lesson of history is that no single law enforcement agency acting on its own has ever sustained a successful attack against organised crime. The only way that this is going to be approached is by a recognition of the scale of the potential threat and the impact that this may have upon our lives and the lives of our sons and daughters, and to approach it with a recognition of bringing a multidisciplinary approach, all the appropriate talents to the table, a multi-agency approach, and undoubtedly a multinational approach. Only by that grand partnership is it going to be possible to hold the line.
Bank security video of a raid